Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 611th New Social Environment. I'm Raven, the Special Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Alex Glauber, Alex Fitzgerald, and David Rhodes. We're thrilled to welcome poet Kenneth Ken Taylor here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions. The Brooklyn Rail would like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You can view today's event and our full archive on the Rail's YouTube channel. And now to introduce today's guests and hosts. Alex Glauber is an art advisor, independent curator, and educator based in New York. In 2009, he founded the AWG Art Advisory, through which he advises private collectors, corporate collections, foundations, and museums on building and managing collections of contemporary art. Glauber has curated exhibitions at a variety of venues, including Bryant Park, Phillips Auction House, and galleries such as Listen, David Lewis, Chapter New York, Dickinson, and Andrew Kreps. He is also a board member of the Brooklyn Rail and the Association of Professional Art Advisors. Alex Fitzgerald is the director at Andrew Kreps Gallery. And New York-based artist and writer David Rhodes is originally from Manchester, UK. He is an editor at large at the Brooklyn Rail and has published reviews in Artforum, Art Critical, among other publications. He has paintings in the permanent collections of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston and the Huntington Museum in Los Angeles. And now over to you, David.
Thank you. Alex, welcome. Could we begin by asking you how this exhibition came together? What was the what initiated the collaboration?
Sure, I'm happy to. As an art advisor, Andrew Kreps Gallery is a gallery that I've known as both a fan and an audience member, but also professionally for well over a decade, and have followed their program and exhibitions closely, and have been fortunate enough to collaborate with them in the past on a number of projects. So I've been part of my art advisory practice. An offshoot of it is curating, and I try to, when able, organize about a show a year, and they're generally tend to be pretty sprawling group shows with a historical bent. So I'd been talking to Alex at the gallery and Andrew Kreps about various ways that we could collaborate on exhibitions for a couple of years now. And this particular moment presented the opportunity to do so. And I'll let Alex speak a little bit on sort of the circumstances and the evolution of the concept.
Yeah, this exhibition actually in some ways started as a very different exhibition. We had, I think we were interested in putting together a show that involved the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, which is a foundation based in Atlanta that supports the work of Black artists from the American South. And I first reached out to Alex because I knew that he had kind of an ongoing relationship with them. And that's kind of how we initially brought him in. I think when we first spoke to them, I think we kind of realized how some of the ways that we had thought about, kind of exhibiting artists from their collection was, I think, we kind of learned that like the way that we were thinking about these artists, who are primarily did not receive formal education and are normally in many ways often referred to as outsider or self-taught artists. The Souls Grown Deep Foundation has really pushed back against that language. And I think it caused us to reconsider, how are we showcasing these artists' work? And so we kind of came together and thought of Assemblage as maybe this sort of unifying strategy or way of making art using extant materials, to unite both artists from the Souls Grown Deep Foundation as well as a variety of artists from, other backgrounds and places.
Yeah, I think this idea of assemblage became this sort of great sort of common denominator in a way. And I had recently come across, and recent being, sort of middle of last year, an original copy of the 1961 exhibition at MoMA, The Art of Assemblage, and spent some time reading through that and realized how many artists that I love personally and have placed with clients were in that original exhibition. And I'd been spending a lot of time researching Dubuffet, who's this interesting sort of nexus point for a lot of the themes the exhibition deals with. Not only was he I believe the first to coin the term assemblage in around 1953, which was when he was experimenting with butterfly wings and making assemblages in France. Even though assemblage is sort of a technique dates back to, I think, 1912 or 1914 with Picasso and Braque. The other interesting thing about Dubuffet is he's sort of a starting point for this much of the problematic language that Alex was alluding to, such as the phrase outsider art. His collection of art brut became a point of fascination for, if I'm recalling correctly, an English scholar and critic named Roger Cardinal, who wrote a book on Dubuffet's collection of art brut, and was overridden by his editors, and in terms of not being allowed to call it art brut, because they thought that terminology wouldn't translate to an Anglo audience, so they called the book outsider art. So that becomes a sort of genesis of outsider art. So Dubuffet is this interesting sort of starting point in some ways for the exhibition, which is why it was so great to include him not only as an artist who was in the original 1961 exhibition at MoMA, but interestingly enough, continues to be a really strong influence on a lot of younger artists and became a point of conversation as we were talking to artists and other galleries about the exhibition and putting it together.
It's very impressive bringing together of so much work and so many museum quality pieces together with works that, as you've been describing, have been perhaps neglected or seen wrongly as outsider, the work of outsiders. It's very interesting to see the leveling effect of bringing these works together, so that we all know the general history of assemblage or collage and its origins in the early 20th century, but to expand William Sykes's exhibition and include artists that would otherwise be neglected, and update it and bring in contemporary artists. I think you've really achieved an overview of what's possible with this very familiar technique that continues to produce very unfamiliar results. I just wondered how you managed to bring together so many of these pieces. I would imagine that for a museum to do this, it would be quite a challenge. And I don't think they would have the mobility to include the lesser known artists with the very high profile artists. So I wonder, how did you go about the selection? What kind of, how did you circumscribe what you would have in the exhibition, given you had a very clear idea, clear concept for the exhibition?
I think one of the interesting things about putting together the exhibition was, in addition to everything that's in the show, how much more there was that could have been included. So definitely, I mean, there's definitely a lot of things that we're very happy to have, and there were things that kind of, you know, it was definitely and I think also being a gallery, we had a bit more flexibility in some way to kind of, you know, as we heard back to from various lenders or galleries or other sources where we were trying to, you know, get the works from, that we were kind of able to, you know, sort of respond quickly, or maybe, you know, kind of make decisions more on, you know, more immediately than more kind of to react as we were kind of finalizing the checklist. But it definitely was down to the wire with a lot of it as well.
Yeah, I'd say I totally agree with Alex. I mean, first and foremost, it wouldn't have happened without the stellar team at the gallery, the preparators, the registrars. My wife jokes with me a lot because a lot of these exhibitions that I've been fortunate enough to put on have a lot of artists in them, and you know, have a big historical breadth. And she always tells me that after I do one of these, I make enemies out of every you know, prep team and registrarial team at a gallery. So it was such a pleasure to collaborate with them. But yeah, to Alex's point, we had a much longer list and just simply ran out of space. I think we use the gallery in its exhibition spaces more broadly and fully, for lack of a better word, than I think has happened in the past at the space. And what was the sourcing part of these exhibitions is always the fun part. And it was really nice that an experience in sort of working with old colleagues and new colleagues, and finding that, you know, I think there was maybe one or two instances where we couldn't include an artist we were hoping to. So we got, you know, phenomenal sort of buy-in and participation. And along those lines, with the attempt of really making it, to your point, David, egalitarian and non-hierarchical. Obviously, I wasn't around to see the show at Moment 61, but just looking at my notes, I mean, that show had 130 artists and over 250 works. And our exhibition has, I think, 46 artists and roughly 80 works. So I think we achieved a point of a large assemblage of an exhibition without making it feel so overburdened that you couldn't appreciate, you know, sort of relationships or dialogues that we were trying to offer to the audience. And to that end, I mean, you know, in terms of installing the exhibition, it took a solid five or 6 days of just kind of sitting with it and stewing with it. And it was kind of like, I use the analogy of trying to solve a Rubik's Cube, which I've never done, but to that end, watch people do it. And, you know, there's that moment perhaps where you finally solve a side, but realize that in the process of doing so, you regress on your progress on the other sides. So there were plenty of moments where Alex and I and Andrew Kreps, who worked on the install with us, found that we had really solved a certain room or wall, but then realized that you know, included a work that we're trying to use elsewhere. So it took a lot of just kind of sitting and letting it evolve in a sort of incremental way, but we're both pretty happy with how it came together.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was a real pleasure to walk through the exhibition and look at works that I would never have imagined being paired together or in proximity to each other. And the exchanges between them were really exciting and very, very thought-provoking. I'm thinking of even, you know, as I was walking around the show, work I'd already seen came to mind in the work I then encountered. So there's some fantastic juxtapositions. Artists such as John Chamberlain and Louise Nevelson and Shakaya Booker. Artists I wouldn't have thought about in dialogue with each other, but fantastic to think about the material resonances between them and the conceptual resonances. Three artists incredibly different with such different backgrounds, and seeing how the way the work communicated, through the viewer was.
Well, that's nice to hear, because I was teasing Alex that when we were telling the show that I'd always wanted to put a work by John Chamberlain next to Shekiah Booker, since he principally worked with metal taken from cars, and Shekiah's principal material is tires.
Right.
It seemed too obvious not to do, and it actually, I think, looks quite good together, despite the heavy-handed or obvious common denominator. But it's nice to hear that it worked for you too.
Yeah. And also with Louise Nevelson, I mean, because of the uniform color. I mean, it's there were many instances where I was being surprised, or I was learning about the resonances between different artists' work, and enjoying visually the way in which there were coincidences, but also I was made very aware of the differences, between the artists and their experience by seeing their works in proximity to each other. And it's quite, it's such a large exhibition that it requires quite a journey through the different spaces of the gallery. So I think that, your idea for the show is really focused, very clear, but the show doesn't feel weighted down by that at all.
Yeah, I think one of the exciting things about going back, or kind of having Seitz's exhibition as a starting point is that, even though there are so many kind of familiar names throughout that you see throughout the list, that there's a lot of, even within that exhibition, there are a lot of surprises as well. Like on the left here, you see a work by on the wall by Alfonso Osorio, who was a friend of Dubuffet's and actually housed Dubuffet's art brut collection. So it's, kind of or Anne Ryan, who was in one of the install views prior, along with Bruce Connor, who was also in the show, that there's kind of, even from that exhibition, there's a lot of kind of uncovering that you can do. And then I think, we were trying to, as we expanded it to the present, kind of also just bring in other artists who could complement that, whether it be someone like Judith Scott, who are very lucky to get a work on loan by, kind of like these, to really kind of build off not only the exhibition, but also the artists of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, and kind of respond to them as we were kind of building out the exhibition.
I was thinking about the Anne Ryan works and how apparently she had seen Kurt Schwitter's works and felt that there was a connection between her sonnets, as she was a poet that also made visual art. So within the exhibition, it's possible to see Schwitter's piece and Anne Ryan's works. So
yeah, there's such a aesthetic and material connection between those two, and that's a good example of situation where in a perfect world we could have done sort of both pairings. It would have been nice to have some of Anne's work near the Schwitters, but I think a real objective was to create unlikely juxtapositions that were fertile to the viewer if they wanted to sort of spend the time with it. And again, sort of the anchor, the first step in putting it together was getting the buy-in and participation of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. And Max Anderson was instrumental in that, who's the president and runs the foundation. And once we got his blessing and were fortunate enough to review their holdings and select a number of artists from the foundation that we felt were really important voices in this story that we wanted to tell, it then was a matter of, the next step was looking at Andrew Kreps' program and thinking about which artists from the program would be an interesting, like Uri Iran right here, who did the table work with Chips Ahoy chocolate chip cookies on the top. And then the next component was thinking about other artists historically or extant living who show with galleries that both Andrew and Alex and myself have relationships with, who would be interesting voices as well. So there were sort of three elements to the sourcing or curatorial process. And again, as I said earlier, we were really fortunate to get tremendous buy-in and participation rate, and these galleries offered really extraordinary examples of their artists. And I was so fortunate and impressed to see the degree of time and sensitivity they put into working with us to find the right work to help tell the story we wanted to tell. And I think it shows.
Yeah, I agree. How does the foundation operate? If you're when you're interested in including work that they represented, do they offer an archive for you to take a look at?
I'm not sure entirely on how they operate and the intricacies, but I will say that I've known a number of people, some board members, and was it sort of around when the foundation was coming together, when Bill Arnett, who was the founder, was still alive. And at that point, I, through a close friend and client, had taken a real interest in a number of the artists that the foundation advocates and serves as a custodian of the work for, such as Thornton Dial and Lonnie Holly. So I had a relationship in one way or another with the foundation for a decade, but this was one of the first times that I collaborated with them as comprehensively on an exhibition. So it was a bit of a leap of faith, and I think both Alex and I felt a real responsibility once we got their buy-in to put forth the work in a very thoughtful and contextualized way, but also offer juxtapositions and a context that was novel and sort of further this effort to break down barriers or obstacles between these different discourses, right, that have coexisted, and trying to, I think, really reduce this notion of the other or the outsider or the self-taught, which becomes somewhat fetishized, and showing how there's this, again, this universal instinct to assemble or organize materials, and how these material juxtapositions exist across geographical lines and cultures in ways that we might not have initially considered.
Right. I really like the work of Emma Sewell. I really like the piece that you had in the show. And it was great to think of it in relation to Jessica Stockholder. And reading about Emma Sewell's background, it's incredible how she incorporated her daily experience of rural Alabama, the way she was so resourceful at bringing together objects that she could find into very sophisticated assemblages. And it's so interesting to see somebody approaching from that direction, and somebody like Jessica Stockholder being resourceful from another direction in a very urban context. But the two of them having so much visually to share. It was very good to see.
Yeah, I think so many of these artists, the works that they made are tied to place because they're responding to their environment. So I think a big theme in the title on it, on the nature of things, David, as we were talking off screen and prior to the talk, you correctly picked up on the reference to Lucretius, his poem De Rerum Natura, which I came to. I studied Latin as an undergrad and remember reading and translating De Rerum Natura, and there's no overt reference, I think, in using that title to Lucretius, but it works really well on the nature of things because there is this sort of duality or this double entendre of nature being both state of being, but also, the natural world. And so many of these artists are pulling from that, whether it is somebody like Emmer Soul, and I'll remember these artists from the Souls Grown Deep Foundation who were creating these environments often on their front lawns, these sort of sculptural tableaus, to somebody like, Yuji Yatamatsu or Kate Noland, who are responding to a different natural world of, urban living in some ways, and detritus.
And I think, another reason why we kind of, when that title was brought up, when Alex brought up that title, why we kind of, really gravitated towards it was that, because also so many of these works are kind of about what material can reveal about, whether it be the maker or the kind of, the kind of wider material culture that it's a part of. So I think you have, some really interesting threads that come up of people, kind of responding to found material and kind of using it to, whether it's in a critical way to address the world in which they're a part of, or whether it's a formal way, like, but yeah, I think there's so many different kind of strategies that different artists in the exhibition are using.
Yeah. In William Sykes's exhibition, in the press release for that 1961 exhibition, he talks about the incarnation. Every artwork is an incarnation. So he points to the material quality of an artwork, which, as you were saying, Alex, also contains something else. And it's such a great relation to Lucretius' text, who's Lucretius basically being a materialist philosopher, rejecting the kind of myths or gods that previous philosophy used as a kind of intermediary, and went straight to the relationship between humans and their environment or their world. So
yeah, and I think the Assemblage too is just such a naked and vulnerable exercise in that it's all laid bare. I mean, there can be a sort of magic or spirituality to the outcome, but the inputs and the creative action reveals itself in most cases. So, I think that quote that you referenced that we pulled into the press release speaks to how the Sykes' exhibition was both about assemblage, but also an assemblage of ideas, and as a curatorial exercise of a group show, an assemblage of objects, which makes me think of John's, and I want to maybe butcher this a bit, but take an object, do something to it, do something else to it. So the instructions are so obvious, but the exercise can be so manifold and varied, and certainly the outcomes too. And again, so we're trying to just show in some ways that the range of how that can exist in terms of various aesthetics, and then all the way up to an artist really Khalil, who did the digital, the light box on one of the walls, Khalil Robert Irving, who showed MoMA recently, and that is a sort of type of digital assemblage. So thinking about what are current artistic or aesthetic strategies and where might we be going next?
Right. It's the inclusion of more recent artists, many more recent artists, emphasizes that this strategy that artists use is still very vital. It's basically evolved. So it's taking on other forms, but it's not, we may see some of the experiments from Cubism or Surrealism or Dada experiments too, as being the kind of being foundational to some of the attitudes we have to assemblage. But it's something which is in process. It's something that is constantly being adapted, which is very evident in your exhibition.
Yeah, I think it becomes it's the byproduct of, I think, the inherent sort of inclination to process and understand things, right? I mean, it sort of lays bare the actual how these artists are engaging, navigating, and understanding the material world. As we let Stop Underneath Against Get probably a great example of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at this, and as you mentioned earlier, David, think about something like Emmer's Stool, where the Emmer's Stools were kind of like these scarecrows that would be on a front lawn. Thinking about that in relation to something like this Isa Genskin, to me is so interesting, and the history of even figurative sculpture dating back to antiquity and contrapposto and things like that.
And I think it's also, one of the, I think that another interesting thing was to see, if you talk about this process of incarnation, or, that how the degrees to which the material is transformed, by different artists, where you clearly have many where the kind of material itself is sort of laid bare and visible and kind of can be located, or here, for example, just in this Dubuffet work, there's this large lotus leaf on the bottom that, or lily pad leaf, that's kind of then just becomes another form or, way of creating the image rather than, its own,
Often it's the material that is speaking. It's there's not a sense that the artist has needed to invent something new, but rather put different things together. So the whole idea of something very corporeal, communicating something other, is it's a very interesting idea. It's something that's kind of in our times of so much information, the emphasis being on a technical communication of information. So many of these pieces speak through the material itself. It's not information with it has a poetic manifestation. It's not telling you something in an instrumental way.
Totally. I think it makes me think now, and I haven't thought about this until this moment, but when you go to a restaurant, maybe one that tends to be more focused on ingredients or farm to table, and you ask them about specials, and they talk about how, this dish is really simple, and the goal was really just to honor the ingredients, right? Let them speak for themselves. And I think you could sort of draw a parallel between that and a lot of these artists, especially in how they look, not even so much the technical treatment of the material, but how they look towards the materials for the symbolism, meaning, or metaphor that's loaded into it fundamentally from their viewpoint or within the context of their biography. So seeing how these artists really perform with these materials and use them as characters in a story, or musical notes in a leitmotif, right? Something like that. They become melodies.
Mm-hmm. And after seeing the exhibition, I was starting to think about painting and how, in many ways, painting is an assemblage of paint and canvas. It's those two materials put together before it's anything else. So the attitude that many of the artists have in presenting a reuse of materials, so that their materials are not materials designed for making art. And they're also materials that have their own history, as you're saying, and these elemental qualities and the history of those objects coming together. It represents a very different approach than taking paint and taking canvas and making something that that hasn't existed before. But of course, the canvas and the paint have their own histories, and a large amount of what happens in a painting is its material qualities. So the use of materials throughout the show extends out to even more areas when thinking about making art. It even, obviously it extends to music or literature. It's an attitude. It's an approach to making, and so
I think due to that appropriative quality, right? There's, as a viewer, you have this sort of double duty of what does the material input or the aesthetic ingredient in this object mean to me outside the context of the artwork, and then what does it mean to the artist, and what are they trying to tell me with it? So you're right, there is that sort of doubling effect or dual identity.
Yeah. When you were going back to when you were both speaking about installing the exhibition, what kind of experience was it to see these works first coming together, such disparate pieces? I mean, it seems perfect as is, but did you feel there were many kind of iterations that could have emphasized different aspects of the work you're bringing together? It seems very much like an exhibition that could grow or could have a part two. It feels generative. It feels like something that could lead to other exhibitions. Or ideas for curation.
Alex, are you ready for part two?
Maybe. Huh. I don't know. I don't know if the rest of the gallery is. Yeah, I mean, the installation. It was kind of, walking into the gallery once things started to come in. It was definitely a bit nerve-wracking at first. Kind of seeing just the sheer volume of things. But I think, a lot of, at least what I felt was driving the way that the exhibition was installed was kind of, the more sort of egalitarian, kind of idea behind the exhibition that you really kind of threw out. While there are, juxtapositions that are material based or are based on, history or, but they're also kind of constantly disrupting that or kind of interjecting something else. There's like a very, and I think you have these small moments, like there's a moment between, these works by Tony Fayer and Liz Magor and Yuji Ajamatsu that are very sort of disparate in their, in kind of the artist's intention, but kind of have this sort of shared transparency or these other sort of moments that come up, or the Nevelson wooden collages next to this Darren Bader sculpture. I think, it was, again, there's, like you said, there are so many artists that could have also been added or included, but we at one point ran out of space to install things. It kind of has crept, if you haven't seen the show yet, it kind of has crept into every crevice of the gallery, including spaces that we don't normally use for exhibitions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges, well, first to answer your question, David, it felt like Christmas morning to me when all the work started arriving. That's always the most exciting part in some ways, but the challenge of installing a show like this is we tried to use models ahead of time to sort of figure out where things would go. Is with a sculptural show, there are fewer wall works. So at some point we tried to prioritize finding works by artists we wanted to include. They've made wall works like Louise Nevelson. It was great to have a grouping of those collages across several decades of her practice, as opposed to a more classical freestanding sort of black wooden assemblage. But this image that you stopped on, all credit here to Alex for this device, which is visible from the main floor of the gallery. If you're looking over this sort of balcony, you look down onto these pedestals, these 9 pedestals, which immediately made me think of Tic-Tac-Toe. So I call it the Tic-Tac-Toe board of assemblage. And you have this extraordinary range of objects from Cornell and Samaras to Judith Scott and Gerald Jackson, David Hammonds and Bessie Harvey. And so really many artists, for instance, I'm certainly not the first, we're not the first people to put a Samaras next to a Cornell, but I think putting a Judith Scott next to a Samaras and sort of allowing their use of yarn to coalesce or speak, or this Joe Minter, very sort of totemic cross-like object next to a Gerald Jackson that has a similar verticality. I mean, these sort of interesting moments that only kind of presented themselves once we happened to just put something down as a placeholder until we could deal with it later. So it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier, that the exercise of installing was really required time more than intellectual rigor, just kind of existing in the space and thinking about how these objects could live together. And something as an art advisor working with private collectors, I often think about how, a great successful installation will put 2 objects next to each other in which the summation of their parts is greater than the inputs. This sort of new discourse or dialogue emerges. And I think there are a lot of moments where that happened purposefully in this exhibition, but even more so where it happened accidentally.
Interesting. Maybe we can open the conversation to questions, Raven, at this point.
Okay. Great. So our first question is from our friend GE, and you should be able to unmute.
Oh, thank you so much, Raven, and thank you, everyone. And David, thank you so much, too. Question is, and it gets back to Lucretius, which obviously is called upon so much here in so many different ways, but not necessarily. As assemblages of these artists, and indeed the assemblage of the show itself, kind of like, two dolls nesting inside of each other almost, with its echoes, of course, Lucretius and the book, are they a way of exploring the nature of mind and soul and ways of sensation and thought and world and phenomenon and ways of fleshing out macros and micro universes? I mean, it seems as though this thing goes everywhere. This is such a wonderful exhibit.
It's a great question. And I'm very glad that my undergraduate Latin professor isn't attending this because my Lucretius knowledge has dwindled. But I think certainly this element of metaphysics and rationalizing one's own existence is a big component of what assemblage is, this state of processing, internalizing, rationalizing, and creating to make sense of the world we live in. And sometimes that's done in a sense of retrospect. Sometimes it's meant to forge forward and push new understanding. But I think there is this sense of reflection and questioning that all these artists are doing, this interrogation of idea, of space, of material. So yeah, I think fundamentally, just as assemblage is something that children do without even knowing what they're doing. It's how we collect things, we organize them, that's how we make sense of our existence. So I think on a philosophical level, there is certainly that connection.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Okay, our next question is from our very own Chloe. So.
Hi, Alex and Alex. Thank you so much for this, and thank you, David. I was wondering, you've touched upon the purposeful versus accidental interactions that have resulted from the show. There's such a pure volume of work in the show, and I'm wondering if you can speak more deeply about a couple of the conversations that resulted that were accidental, and kind of what that was like for you as you were planning the exhibition, and what resulted, and often like what you thought was going to happen versus what actually happened.
Alex, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I think just because of the volume of artworks and artists, I felt like a lot of the installation, there was a good part of the installation that was kind of a problem solving, or like or logistical, like in this way of like how to accommodate everything. But I think one of like the sort of really interesting things that kind of came up for me is like this difference between like an artist's inner or outer like world. Like you have someone like Yuji Ajamatsu who's using his work to really kind of document his daily life or experience. And it's this process of, kind of recording almost his, time in this way. And then you have that next to artists who are really using found material in a very different way, which is to kind of communicate about an outer world or a larger culture. And it's, I love like seeing the Caddy Noland in front of Ronald Lockett, like that it's in some way materially related, kind of using found metal. Obviously the Katie Noland is branded, but it is like, you know, these kind of, you maybe see like these similar impulses from very different experiences or very different lived experiences.
Thank you. I wonder, I have a short question as well. Assemblage historically sort of challenged the commercial gallery system. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit to that, and how you thought about that in putting this show together and this amazing group of artists together in the space.
I think that one's you, Alex.
Yes, it is. I'm, you know, well, that's, you know, that is definitely, thing, but at the same time, I think, you know, kind of when we were conceptualizing it, we realized how much assemblage is important to a lot of like the practices of many of the artists that we work with. You know, in the show from our program, there is Mike Lee Smith, who's an American sculptor, Raymond Saunders, Uri Iran, Darren Bader, Liz Magor, Michael Dean. So it was really, you know, it kind of, you know, that sort of concern wasn't as present just because it felt like such a natural fit with some of the artists that we work with or kind of the work that we do here all the time. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think also in the show was in some ways not necessarily a commercial endeavor for us. You know, but it's nice to have that, like that flexibility and freedom as well.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, you know, I am commercially involved from the standpoint that I'm an art advisor and deal with the gallery and other galleries all the time in helping my clients acquire works and build collections. But when curating exhibitions, my commitment and interest is in the idea. And you know, some things for putting together a show like this, some things were just not going to happen. Like, love to have a great Rauschenberg like Canyon, but I don't think MoMA was going to send it over. And
yeah,
we considered a couple of Picassos, but couldn't find the right one. But on the whole, part of the privilege of working on this show with Alex in the gallery and its success was because even though Andrew Kreps Gallery is a commercial gallery and sells art, they wanted to put together a great exhibition and knew that meant you know, paying to ship things from distant places that wouldn't necessarily be for sale, but were instrumental in sort of rounding out the concept and articulating the idea. And they were committed to that, and tolerant of my requests, being a cost center.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your answers.
Pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Chloe, for your wonderful questions. And our final question is from our favorite and very own Fong Bui. So
thank you, Raven. Thank you, David, for moderating this wonderful conversation about the show. The show is so ambitious, but at the same time seems very effortless too in curation. There are parallels that are so subtle. Sometimes it's image, sometimes it's form, sometimes it's material. And now that you mentioned Rauschenberg, Alex, it's interesting to think of the fact that he was born in Port Arthur, Texas. So imagine when he was going back and forth during his couple of years at Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina. You can imagine he must have written through a lot of vernacular art, I mean, African-American community, who in a way, in a yard, would not be things that were easily thrown away. There's the massive accumulation, thing that naturally piling up, that led to a certain kind of construction that is not at all what we thought of it. In other words, when you think about Rauschenberg, for example, the way that he used color, in addition to the collage element, the color is not used as optical effect. they use as a construction, the constructed means, you know. So it's so interesting to me because to think of when you ask, for example, David is from England, as you can imagine. And if you ask, let's say, the Rolling Stone, you ask Mick Jagger, you know, or the great Keith Richards, who had immense influence on your early sound or musical identity, and they have no problem saying it's John Lee Hooker, Bo Diddley, Muddy Waters. If you ask the Animal, Eric Burton, he will say the same. Howlin' Wolf. So it's interesting in music where people readily admit it. Those are master with the Delta Blue master from the South, or the Chicago Electric master when the migration to the North that occurred to, you know, a lot of great label up there in the late 50s, like Gator, Chess Record, you know. So it's interesting that somehow we are less, you know, we seem anxious to acknowledge that in the art. You know, that's why this show is so terrific. You just look at the art and you don't need to mediate the differences between the taught and self-taught, you know. See Thornton Dial right next to, you know, another artist, I don't know, Rauschenberg's not there, but one artist that I was thinking too, when I was walking through, and you tell me whether that could be a potential inclusion, at least in your mind at the time, both of you, Alex, is Lethal Roth. You know, I was thinking Lethal Roth. It just because wherever his idea of collage or combine is the opposite of Rauschenberg and other things that I've seen in the show. So I just wonder whether you thought of, you know, you thought of him, his work in that context.
We definitely discussed the work. To be perfectly candid, there were other artists that we were more eager to include, but ran out of space or couldn't find the right work. But I think what you're saying, Vaughn, is spot on, and that thinking back to conversations I had with Bill Arnett, who is the founder of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation and who's credited with discovering, advocating much of his life for the work of the artists that they promote, such as Lonnie Hawley and Thornton Dial, two of the first artists that he met. Bill would say to me that, like, look, driving around the South in the 80s, it occurred to me that in the same way that the musical traditions of the Black South were essential to pop and modern music as we understand it, and it is sort of the backbone of something that is distinctly American in culture, there has to be a visual equivalent that the art world as he knew it at the time had yet to identify or concern itself with. So that was really, I think, the catalyst that drove him to finding and promoting these artists. And I think certainly, while, you know, Dial really wasn't making work, you know, Assemblage just until like the 80s really, or known to do so. There is certainly a visual parallel with artists like, you know, Rauschenberg and Kiefer and things like that. And he's certainly coming out of a society and a culture that had deep roots, and as you note, Rauschenberg would have been exposed to.
Yeah. Okay, cool. The other, what did you guys work with a model in beforehand, or you just sort of go
just
along?
Two East Againskins in the middle.
Yeah, we did have a model, which we tried to, which I mean was helpful as far as the initial sort of layout, but I think, as Alex sort of mentioned before, so much of having so much sculptural work, it made it quite difficult to really get a sense of how it would feel in material in the space or translate from. And we work with models, you know, all the time for every show and fair, but for this one, it was kind of a bit more difficult to translate it from the model to the gallery. So we gave it a good try with the model and started from there, and then it kind of kept evolving.
Well, I love the all the pedestal of the smaller works right below the stairs. It's you walk in the gallery, you have that immense space and a lot of breathing room. And then when you walk downstairs, you are compelled to walk among the pedestal, the sculptural works. And it seemed to keep you longer in that room, which is interesting to me. Before you get released again when you walk back to the back room. But so I thought curatorially it was very clever and thoughtful. So congratulations to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Back to you, Raven.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for this amazing conversation, and thank you all for your great questions. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our conversations with a poetry reading. And I would like to welcome our poet, Ken Taylor. Ken Taylor is the author of First the Trees, Now This, Dog with Elizabethan Collar, Self-Portrait as Joseph Carnell, and Aromancy Garage. He is the founder and co-editor of Selva Oscura Press. Ken's current and past projects can be viewed at Hey Clown Ventures or heyclown.com. Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It was great listening to the conversation. I hope the exhibit is open through October when I'll be in New York. So, and I love hearing that Alabama is represented in Thornton Dial and others from Alabama. So I'm going to read 3 short poems from this book called Self-Portrait as Joseph Carnell. Seems in fitting with the theme that's been talked about today. They're all collage sonnets. The first one is called How to Draw 7 Circles. And it's the only one I have a little art to go with it. This is Seymour Quast drawing. He's deconstructing Mickey Mouse in a way to instruct people how to draw. So that's the first poem, How to Draw 7 Circles. Open with the mouse model and close your eyes. Walk with arms extended for fresh exposure. Coryphée fetid in a bipartite division, strike each chair in the cunning little machine before you bump into one who bears a burden and longing and cry through which you entered an exit. This erasure of featured ears composes the first 2. The sestet eases the load. You have fallen, but they'll cushion and convey before faces touch. Eyes, soft targets for 2 more. Lift torches in the curve of a baby grand while origins tail footfalls. Deconstruct the nose for an unexpected duo. Now, void the crown. And the second poem is called First the Trees, Now This. It's a title poem for a chapbook I wrote. Shapes of leaves are trying to tell me something different than the strata of Latin or what might make me itch. They are stanzas to walk around in. The ovals send rumors over opposite walls. Darker yellows seek wax. Others, the sweet tones of a 38 Epiphone acoustic guitar, scroll cutouts. I notice close by, apertures film over. Trace memory or the kind of joy saved for bigger days. Later, walnuts get antsy waiting to be pulverized. My youngest slips from a shy rendezvous, from shade under the trampoline, beams at her older sister. Smell my face, I smell like boy. And the last poem is called Self-Portrait as Joseph Carnell, the title poem from this book. Not once did I lift the skirt of a ballerina. Boxes in the yard means a local scandal and thus all this organized departure. Birds will live here for a time before they pipe broken clay songs and wake the neighbors. Rose comes, not the actress, but the slight era before constellations show or planets in a darker crinoline with fresh instructions. Everyone says it's important to masticate. Smaller food suits you. This found laundry ticket fends off sophistry. My flautist rang the other day and claimed she couldn't keep our appointment. Hiccuping ampersands again, she said, and dust and glass and swan. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was amazing. And thank you, Alex, Glauber, Alex Fitzgerald, and David. And I'd also like to thank Connor and everyone else at Andrew Kreps Gallery for helping make today's event possible. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political mediations in our monthly publication and in our public events, like here in our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate and support our writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with a radical poetry reading with Rochelle Brin, John Coletti, Will Ferris, Almajir Hashimi, and Ann Waldman. You can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Ken, for the beautiful reading. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is great. Thank you. And go see the show, please.
I want to
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
We'll be there for a while, so please go see the show for those who haven't seen it. So it's highly recommended. So now we can go to have lunch. And congrats, guys.
Thank you
Thanks.
all.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
so
Thank you.
much.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Congrats. Thank you, Ken. Bye.
Bye.